The film begins by showing a new type of European Airlines aircraft, namely the Atrian 800, flying from Paris to Dubai. Due to an impending turbulence zone, all passengers are asked to sit down and fasten their seat belts immediately. But suddenly, the plane dropped drastically, resulting in an accident. On the other hand, a black box expert named Matthew, known for his acute hearing, works at the BEA, the Civil Aviation Safety Investigation Bureau, which investigates unusual air accidents. One day, the office is bustling because of a new accident involving an Atrian 800 aircraft with 300 passengers and 16 crew members on board. Its flight route was from Paris to Dubai, and the crash site is in the Haute-Savoie Mountains. To investigate the cause of the accident, a chief investigator named Victor Pollock invites Balson to assist him, because Matthew has often worked with him in the past. Afterward, Matthew retrieves a special investigation case to give to Balson, but while returning, his case accidentally grazes Victor's car, leaving a mark, and the CCTV in Victor's car clearly captures Matthew's face. Following this, Matthew meets his wife Naomi and also his director. They all work at Pegasus Security, a company specializing in aircraft computer network. On their way home, they discuss the plane crash, where before the incident, the pilot lost contact with air traffic control, or ATC. Meanwhile, the BEA has retrieved the black box from the Atrian 800 aircraft. An important piece of information is that the black box is not black, but orange for easier detection. The black box has two parts: the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, where the FDR records technical data during flight such as altitude, speed, inclination, engine power, and others in the form of graphs or transcripts. Meanwhile, the CVR records conversations inside the cockpit, including conversations linked to the speakers, internal cockpit conversations, pilot conversations with ATC, and the ambience of the aircraft such as engine noise or weather. At that time, Victor and his team are about to open the CVR and its live recording, which Matthew watches from the office. After being opened very carefully, the CVR device is immediately cleaned. Its recording file is downloaded, and it will be listened to by Victor and Balson. The next day, Matthew is summoned by BEASO, named Rainier, who informs him that Victor has disappeared, and Balson is struggling to analyze the black box. Because there will be a press conference at 7 p.m. to discuss the contents of the CVR, Rainier asks him to analyze it promptly with Balson. After that, Matthew diligently focuses on listening. Even the slightest noise or static due to Balson's tangled cables can be heard. After listening to roughly the contents of the CVR conversation, it appears that the pilot and co-pilot were talking to air traffic control. Then, a flight attendant named Jean came while bringing food. Later, the same flight attendant returned, and then the sound of other footsteps entering the cockpit was heard. At that moment, there were rustling sounds, and only the pilot's voice was heard at the end of the recording indicating that the plane was going to crash. After that, Matthew tried to focus once more, even asking Balson's legs to stop moving. Then, to clarify the recording sound further, Matthew tried various methods, until eventually, the voice of a screaming male passenger was heard. Sometime later, a press conference attended by many media outlets was held, where Rainier said that there might be a passenger fighting with the pilot in the cockpit. Matthew then explained the situation in more detail with his analysis, where the intruder entered the cockpit right after the flight attendant entered while the door was still open. However, his analysis is still speculative, and it cannot be concluded whether the intruder is a terrorist. Upon arriving home, Naomi, driven by curiosity from seeing her husband's sternness during the conference, confronted him. Then the next morning, the news reported that the passenger who had sneaked into the cockpit was a man from Egypt who was an extremist. At the same time, Rainier's expertise and success in analyzing the CVR led him to appoint Matthew as the head investigator, replacing his superior, Victor, because up to that day, he was still missing. Shortly after, Matthew approached a man who claimed to have a voice message from his wife, who was a victim of the accident. In the message, his wife said that it was chaotic inside the plane, with everyone screaming until the plane crashed. Matthew eventually borrowed the man's phone to examine the voice message from his wife, which indicated a time of 7:56 in the morning. After knowing this, Matthew felt suspicious because upon checking, it turned out the plane crashed at 7:53 in the morning. A few moments later, this suspicion was immediately conveyed to Rainier, but according to him, there might be an error or time discrepancy between the internet site, the voice message, or the flight radar, as the time difference was only 3 minutes. However, for some reason, since then Matthew, increasingly suspicious and obsessed, as he couldn't let go of the incident. Wherever he went, Matthew always listened to the CVR and visited the secured wreckage of the plane. Matthew then checked the list of all passengers, looked at photos of passengers uploaded to social media, and continued listening to the CVR. At that moment, with a high level of focus, Matthew could make himself feel as if he were on the plane, where he suspected the Egyptian individual turned out to be completely innocent. After that, Matthew's suspicion grew even larger, causing him to be haunted by the CVR sound. Since Victor still hadn't shown up, Matthew suspects him and decides to go into his room. After checking his desk, Matthew found a password and Victor's home address, and immediately went to that address. When he arrived at Victor's house, the place appeared empty and Matthew recklessly climbed the fence to get in. Unfortunately, he found the door locked and the windows closed. The only option was to break a window to get inside and search room by room until found Victor's laptop. Luckily, Matthew had previously taken a photo of the password written in the notebook, so he was able to unlock it. However, to his dismay, there were no files on the laptop. With nothing left to investigate, Matthew was about to leave. But when Matthew saw a car in the garage, he remembered that the car had a CCTV which accidentally got knocked at the beginning of the footage. After obtaining the car keys, Matthew immediately opened it and retrieved the CCTV memory. As each video was checked one by one, suddenly a dog startled Matthew, where he asked the owner of the dog about Victor's whereabouts. But the last time the man saw Victor was yesterday. Upon returning home, Matthew checked the car's CCTV again and found that on October 11th, or 3 days after the accident, Victor returned home from the office at 2 o'clock in the morning. However, Victor stopped in the middle of the road as if contemplating something. With no other oddities, Matthew then played the recording before October 8th or before the accident occurred. After hours of watching, there was still no anomaly. Until September 30th around 10 p.m., Matthew met someone on the rooftop of a building who turned out to be the director of Pegasus Security, Xavier. After further investigation, Matthew found out that Pegasus Security sold its computer network to European airlines, specifically in their new plane, Atrian. Upon knowing this, Matthew immediately asked his colleague named Samir to analyze the system of the Atrian 800 aircraft, which could not be controlled by the pilot, and might have a malfunction in the MHD system or the system that could automatically stabilize the aircraft's position. After that, Matthew picked up his wife, Naomi, who had just returned from work, and asked her about the security of the devices from Pegasus Security used by the Atrian aircraft. Naomi then replied that the devices were certainly safe because they had been tested and certified. On the other hand, Xavier, who knew Matthew's suspicion from Naomi, invited him to meet. At that moment, Xavier said that Pegasus system was actually secure. But Matthew immediately showed the CCTV footage of Victor meeting Xavier. Upon seeing this, Xavier calmly replied that they were indeed working on a project and continued to corner Matthew, who had accused him of being the mastermind behind the Atrian aircraft accident, while accused Matthew of being too paranoid. Because Matthew often listened to the recording and fundamentally disliked public gatherings, suddenly his head was filled with loud noises, prompting him to leave Xavier immediately. That night, when Naomi was already asleep, Matthew secretly opened his laptop to find out about Pegasus Security's data and finally found documents about the Atrian aircraft test, which he copied onto a flash drive. The next day, the documents were immediately reported to Rainier without mentioning Victor's car's CCTV. The leak of these secret documents reached the ears of Pegasus Security officials, and Naomi was eventually fired from the company because it was proven that the secret documents owned by BA came from her laptop. Clearly, Naomi was very angry upon knowing that her husband had taken the Atrian test documents secretly. At that moment, Matthew could only apologize as those documents were not supposed to leak out. Matthew also admitted that he desperately needed those documents to prove that the CVR recording was a mistake. Since then, their marriage fell apart, and Matthew mostly spent his day in his office. Until Matthew saw a black car that seemed to be spying on him. At that moment, Matthew boldly opened the car, but it turned out to be just a dream. Matthew, who was sleeping in the office, was awakened by Samir to test the MHD system, suspected to be the cause of the plane crash. After testing, there were no issues, and Matthew, still not convinced, continued testing multiple times. However, the results remained the same. Due to stress and emotion, Matthew became uncontrollable and even slammed the computer after finding nothing from his search. To calm himself temporarily, Matthew stayed at his sibling's house, while accompanied his nephew playing with a drone in the park. However, a group of teenagers hacked his nephew's drone system to control it themselves. Upon seeing this, Matthew thought perhaps the computer network of Atrian 800 had already been hacked, the same with the drone. After that, Matthew met Xavier again to discuss the possible cause of the accident, that the computer network might have been hacked by someone. However, Xavier immediately replied that Matthew's statement was exaggerated and it was impossible for their highly advanced aircraft network to be hacked. After that, Matthew met his journalist acquaintance named Laura to inform her about the aircraft network hacking issue. However, according to Laura, Matthew's accusations lacked strong evidence, and the only hacking attempt ever made was a year ago, where a man named David Keller tried to hack the aircraft engine speed to prove the weakness of Pegasus Security's network. Unfortunately, David was imprisoned for several months for attempting to hack the aircraft network as proof, but now David was free. Upon hearing this, Matthew immediately searched for photos of passengers on social media, where David Keller was seen on the plane. Strangely, David Keller's name was not on the passenger list. Sometime later, Matthew met Naomi to ask for her help because he had to gather more evidence of anomalies. But Naomi, who was already tired of her husband's obsession, didn't care and left him. Not only that, but Rainier also had to transfer Matthew because he followed his instincts without facts and foundation. Until eventually, Matthew saw the helicopter accident video that had been investigated by him and Victor before the plane crash happened. Where the date the file was saved was the day Victor worked late, or the 11th. Even though Matthew clearly last saved it on the 8th. That meant Victor deliberately left a clue from the video because only the two of them had access to that laptop. When the sound was set to reduce the static, Matthew suddenly heard hidden numbers, which turned out to be a set of coordinates. Upon arriving there, the location turned out to be a lake not far from Victor's house. With a boat anchored there, Matthew used it to reach the coordinates in the middle of the lake. After that, he dove into the water and found the original black box of the Atrian 800 plane deliberately hidden by Victor. At that moment, Matthew went into Victor's house to listen to the original CVR. This is where all the facts will be revealed. So at that time, David Keller boarded the Atrian 800 plane to restore his reputation after being imprisoned by hacking Pegasus' network system as proof that its security system was indeed weak. Secretly, David connected his laptop to an adapter under the seat to link with the cockpit. His intention was just to do minor hacking to change the flight route and take control of the computer network security, but it turned into an uncontrollable error that even David himself couldn't cancel, where the plane's speed eventually decreased drastically, and he could only resign himself to the fact that the plane would crash into a mountain. In addition to the original CVR recording, Victor also combined a video confession of himself. It turned out that at the beginning of the investigation, Victor deliberately didn't involve Matthew so that he could expose Xavier's Pegasus directorial corruption. Indeed, Matthew was able to find clue after clue through his own analysis and the clues provided by Victor until obtaining the original CVR. Victor then confessed that years ago, Xavier had bribed him to obtain information about Pegasus' device errors. After that, the Atrian 800 accident occurred, which Xavier knew was caused by David's hacking, which is resulting in David's name to be removed from the passenger list so the public wouldn't know the cause of the plane crash. Xavier also threatened to ruin Victor's career if he didn't help him falsify the original black box CVR. Therefore, it was all just sound engineering created by Victor, who had been threatened by Xavier. If the public knew that Pegasus' computer network security was very weak, the public would condemn it, and Xavier would surely go bankrupt. At that moment, Victor confessed his mistake and hoped Xavier would be arrested soon. Shortly after, Matthew heard voices outside and immediately transferred the file online, then turned off all the electricity except in Victor's workspace. Just as Matthew hid, two men sent by Xavier entered to hunt him down. As the transfer process wasn't complete and Matthew was increasingly cornered, he turned on the CVR recording in the workspace to distract the henchmen. Shortly after, the transfer process finally completed, and Matthew quickly left for his car to escape. But it turned out the two men had installed a device in his car that could hack the car system remotely. As a result, Matthew couldn't control his car, and he eventually died in a high-speed accident. Not long after, Naomi, still devastated by her husband's death, attended the launch event of Pegasus's new AI computer network introduced by Xavier. But suddenly, Victor's confession video was displayed on the big screen and sent to all the journalists' phones there, because it turned out Matthew had transferred the original CVR file and Victor's confession to Naomi. As the result, Xavier's corruption and Pegasus's corruption were finally exposed, where Xavier was finally arrested. At that moment, Naomi finally felt relieved because Matthew's struggle had been vindicated. However, Naomi finally regretted her decision after she had not believed her husband's words all this time. Moral lesson from the story: the truth is like finding a lost sock in the laundry, and it can be a real puzzle. So, it's important to trust your instincts, even if they seem as silly as looking for socks in the washing machine. You never know what surprising secrets might come out in the end.